Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now let's get started. I was working late in the office, the kind of late that makes the city outside look empty and cold. Most of the lights in the building were already off, and the hum of air conditioning and the occasional creak of the structure were the only sounds. I had been staring at my computer screen for hours, finishing the last of a report that was due the next morning. My eyes were sore, my back ached, and my stomach reminded me that I had skipped dinner. When I finally hit save and closed my laptop, I stretched and grabbed my coat. The hallways were deserted, silent except for the echo of my own footsteps. I pressed the elevator button, watching the small digital numbers flash. The elevator arrived with its usual ding, and the doors opened to reveal the familiar metal interior. I stepped in, pressed the lobby button, and the doors closed behind me. For a moment, the soft hum of the motor and the quiet swish of the elevator moving felt almost comforting. Then the lights flickered once. I froze. It was a quick flicker, barely noticeable, but it set my nerves on edge. The elevator jolted slightly, like it had hesitated for a moment before continuing. Then, without warning, everything went completely black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I pressed the buttons again, desperate, but nothing responded. The soft hum of the elevator stopped. Silence pressed down on me, thick and heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried my phone, hoping for some light, maybe even a signal to call for help. Nothing. No service. The screen glowed briefly, but the weak signal bar was empty. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. It was high-pitched, almost electronic, like wires buzzing, but irregular, shifting and muttering. It seemed to be coming from above, from the higher floors. My stomach turned, and I pressed myself against the wall of the elevator. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just the building settling, maybe the machinery acting up. But the sound continued, faint but persistent, rising and falling like it had its own rhythm. I hit the emergency button. A weak, crackling voice answered after a long pause, but the connection was garbled. I couldn't make out words, just static and that faint humming sound underneath. I tried again. Same result. My heart was racing now. My legs felt like lead, my hands clammy. I swallowed hard, trying to think rationally. The elevator jerked suddenly, sharply downward. A grinding noise echoed through the metal walls. I clutched the railing, bracing myself as the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. The lights flickered back on briefly, harsh and bright, before going dark again. I could feel every movement, every vibration through my shoes, the sound of metal on metal filling my ears. Then it stopped. Dead silence. The lights returned fully this time, and I blinked, disoriented. The digital display showed B1, the basement level. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. The doors slid open, and I was met not with the familiar lobby basement, but with a narrow corridor I had never seen. The air was thick, damp, smelling of mold and something far older, decay. My shoes made soft squelching noises on the wet concrete. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic drops. Rust ran in streaks along the walls. I couldn't see the end of the corridor. It stretched into shadows that seemed almost to move as I looked at them. I stepped out cautiously, my hand brushing the wall for guidance. The texture was rough and cold. The lights above were dim, flickering weakly, barely illuminating the path. The humming from before was gone, replaced by the occasional distant clang or drip, a sound that made my skin crawl. I considered going back to the elevator, but the doors had closed behind me, and pressing the button did nothing. I started walking down the corridor. The floor was uneven, puddles in some places, and I had to watch every step. The smell was getting worse, like something had been left to rot for months. I could see stains along the walls and floors, dark patches that I didn't want to examine too closely. The ceiling above had pipes, some leaking water, others vibrating lightly, creating low, metallic groans that echoed in the confined space. As I moved forward, I realized the corridor was not straight. It twisted slightly, corners opening into larger rooms I didn't recognize. One room had shelves, empty and rusted, with broken crates on the floor. Another had machinery, old and abandoned, with wires hanging loose and flickering lights that cast more shadows than they illuminated. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. The sense of being somewhere forbidden, somewhere no one had been for a long time, settled in my chest like a weight. I kept walking. Every sound was amplified, my shoes squishing in puddles, my breath echoing against the walls, the occasional drip from above. The air was cold and damp, sticking to my skin. My mind raced. How had the elevator taken me here? Was this part of the building that was abandoned? A maintenance area no one ever used? It didn't make sense, not logically. But the building was enormous, old, and some floors were dedicated to storage, utilities, or emergency systems. I told myself it must be one of those areas. I found a set of stairs leading upward. They were steep and narrow, metal rungs slick with moisture. I gripped the railing and climbed, counting each step, afraid that the structure might not hold, that it might collapse under me. At the top, I emerged into a long, narrow maintenance hall. The lighting was better here, though still dim, fluorescent tubes buzzing faintly. I could see a sign indicating a service elevator and emergency exit. Relief hit me in a wave. I wasn't trapped forever. I followed the signs, my steps quicker now, and finally reached a door marked emergency exit. The handle was cold and stiff, but it turned. I pushed, and the door opened to a stairwell leading up. The air was fresher here, drier, and I felt hope returning. I climbed, counting each floor as I went. The stairwell walls were painted a dull gray, chipped in places, but familiar enough to suggest I was back in a standard part of the building. When I finally reached the lobby, I stepped out into the brightly lit, empty space. The city outside glowed through the large windows, streets quiet but alive with distant traffic. The elevator doors at the far end of the lobby were functioning normally, opening and closing with their usual ding. I took a deep breath, the tension in my body finally releasing. I walked outside, feeling the cold night air on my face, my mind racing but clear. The city felt normal again, alive and structured, nothing like the decayed, wet corridor I had just escaped. My shoes squished, leaving wet marks on the pavement, but I didn't care. I had a story in my mind now, one I knew I would never forget, but I was safe. I could go home. The fear that had rooted me in the basement corridor loosened, replaced by the comforting knowledge that some systems fail, but there is always a way out if you keep moving and stay aware. I didn't take the elevator again that night. Instead, I walked to my car, my steps slow and careful, every sound around me amplified as I moved through the near-empty streets. But the city felt alive, structured, and reassuring. I knew that no matter how strange or disorienting the building's hidden corners might be, I had faced it, stayed calm, and found the way out. By the time I drove home, the adrenaline had faded, leaving me exhausted but relieved. I promised myself I would never underestimate the importance of emergency knowledge. Stairs, exits, pathways. Technology and elevators can fail, lights can go out, but awareness and calm can save you. I locked my apartment door behind me, still shivering slightly, but with a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had faced something terrifying, disorienting, and completely real, and I had come out the other side. Even now, when I think about that night, I remember the smell, the dampness, the silence, and the flickering lights. But I also remember the path I took, the steps I climbed, and the door I found. The building was old and strange in parts, yes, but nothing could trap me forever. I had survived because I stayed focused, moved carefully, and refused to give in to panic. And that realization gave me a calm certainty I hadn't felt before. I survived. I had found my way back. I remember the night like it was carved into my memory with jagged edges, every second stretching longer than it should have. I had been alone in that old cabin up in the Adirondacks, the kind that looked perfectly cozy from the outside, with dark wooden walls and a little stone chimney that puffed out smoke in the daytime. But at night, when the sun sank behind the dense trees, it felt like the forest itself swallowed everything. The cabin's walls, normally warm and comforting, suddenly felt tight, like the wood was pressing in on me. It was 1:03 a.m. when the power went out. I had been writing in my notebook, hunched over a small table near the window, the candle flickering weakly beside me. The words on the page were sloppy, more a jumble of half-thoughts than anything meaningful, but I couldn't stop. Writing like this, in the dead hours, was something I needed to do. It was the only way I could calm the constant buzzing in my head. But the sudden snap of darkness made the candle die instantly, the flame flickering once, and then nothing. The silence hit me like a wall. No hum of the fridge, no faint buzz of the heater, not even the usual creaks of the cabin settling. The forest outside had gone dead. I froze, heart hammering. At first, I thought maybe it was just a freak blackout. I fumbled in the darkness for my flashlight, but my hands found only empty batteries. I had been lazy, hadn't replaced them before the trip. I cursed myself under my breath and strained to listen. And then I heard it. A scratching sound. At first soft, almost delicate, like someone running their fingernails along glass. I thought it might be a branch brushing against the window in the wind. But the wind wasn't blowing. I could feel the air still, thick and heavy. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, moving in rhythm. My stomach twisted. It came from the window directly across the room from me. I dared not move. Then, the scratching became pounding. Sharp, violent knocks that made the window rattle in its frame. My mind screamed at me to grab something, anything, but I couldn't. My whole body had gone numb. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was an animal. Bears did roam here, foxes, raccoons. But none of them could pound like that. None would knock with such purpose. I pressed my back against the wall and forced myself to breathe slowly, in and out, trying to convince myself it was something simple. The pounding stopped suddenly. My chest heaved. Silence. But it was a heavy silence this time, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that feels wrong. I told myself to calm down, that I was just letting my imagination run wild. I edged toward the door, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, every step echoing in the quiet. Then I heard it again. Not at the window this time, but closer. Something scraping along the walls, soft at first, like claws dragging slowly across the wood. I could hear it moving, circling, deliberate and patient. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but every nerve in my body was screaming danger. My mind went through every worst-case scenario I'd ever imagined, each more terrifying than the last. I stumbled outside before I even realized I was moving, bare feet hitting the damp grass. The night air was freezing, sharp against my skin, but I didn't care. My first thought was to run, to put distance between me and whatever was in the cabin. But when I looked around, all I could see was mist hovering low over the lake. The mist clung to the ground, curling around the trunks of the trees, so thick that I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. I strained my eyes, searching for movement, but there was nothing. Only the silver-gray fog and the black shadow of the treeline. I took a shaky breath and tried to think. What could have caused the pounding? Maybe someone had broken in. My stomach dropped at the thought. I knew the cabin was remote, far from any neighbors or the road. It would take a while for anyone to arrive. I felt trapped, exposed in the open air, yet afraid to return to the cabin because I didn't know if it was safe inside. That's when I noticed the window. The one that had been pounding, the one I had stared at frozen in terror. It was wide open. The lock had been forced. The glass was intact, thankfully, but the cold wind blew straight into the cabin through the empty frame. I couldn't see any footprints, no sign of anyone entering or leaving. Only the mist over the lake, moving lazily as if nothing had happened at all. I didn't know what to do. I stayed in the yard, shivering, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something else, small marks on the wooden wall near the window. Scratches, deep and erratic, running up toward the frame. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had left evidence. And they hadn't just knocked. They had tried to get in. My mind raced. Could it have been an animal? Maybe a bear or a coyote trying to get inside for warmth. Possible. But bears don't knock in rhythm. Coyotes don't scratch like that. I decided I had to check inside, but I couldn't just step back into the dark. I ran to my car parked a little way down the path, fumbling through the glove compartment for the spare batteries I kept there. Luckily, I had thought ahead enough to store a small flashlight and fresh batteries in the car. I replaced them quickly, hands shaking, and clicked it on. The cabin looked worse under the harsh white beam of the flashlight than it had in the soft glow of the candle. The window frame was splintered, the lock bent, and inside, there were scratches along the floorboards leading away from the window. Nothing else seemed disturbed, no items knocked over, no sign of someone hiding inside. It was eerie the way everything seemed almost normal, except for that obvious point of intrusion. I stayed on edge for hours, checking the perimeter of the cabin, shining the flashlight into every corner, scanning the trees beyond. Nothing moved. The forest looked empty still, as if it had never made a sound. The mist over the lake gradually thinned as dawn approached. I stayed outside, sitting on the cold grass, and watched the pale sun creep over the horizon. By morning, the fear had settled into a kind of numb exhaustion. Whatever had caused the pounding had gone. I didn't see tracks, I didn't see an animal, and there was no one around. Only the broken window, the scratches, and the cold wind blowing through the cabin. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't explained by ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's the reality of isolation, the randomness of nature, and the unexplainable events that just happen. I called the ranger station as soon as I could get a cell signal and reported the incident. They said no reports of bear or coyote attacks in the area, no missing persons. Just the usual forest noises. I packed up my things and left the cabin, the early morning mist rising over the lake like a thin curtain. The window remained open, a silent witness to the night's terror. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. I won't ever go alone to that cabin again. I'll never forget the silence, the pounding at the window, the way my heart felt lodged in my throat while the forest held its breath around me. And somehow, that memory is far worse than any shadow or story I could imagine. It's real, and it's enough to make me never want to feel that helpless again. The cabin sits empty now, and every time I drive past it on the old winding road, I can't help but glance at the lake. The mist there looks harmless in daylight, calm even. But I know better. I know that the quiet can hide sharp claws, pounding hands, or whatever force that night had unleashed. And I know that if I ever hear a scratching at the window again, I won't be standing there, frozen. I'll be running, because some fears are worth obeying, and survival is a clear, simple rule. That night at the cabin taught me something I'll carry forever. Sometimes the world doesn't give reasons. Sometimes the terror is just there, uninvited, and all you can do is get away. I left the Adirondacks with my notebook, my flashlight, and a heart still racing, but also with a strange kind of respect for the silence, for the night, and for the things that go unseen until they make themselves known. The window is still broken, I think. The cabin is empty, the lake undisturbed. And that's exactly the way I like it. It was 10:15 p.m., and the Northern Line train was moving through the tunnels under London like it did every night, carrying a handful of passengers who were mostly quiet, lost in their phones or staring blankly at the advertisements plastered on the walls. I had boarded at Camden, sitting alone near the middle of the carriage, and the hum of the train combined with the low chatter of other passengers created a strange sense of comfort. I always liked this part of the ride, the moment when the city above disappears, replaced by the dimly lit tunnel walls rushing past outside the windows. Then, without warning, the train shuddered violently and came to a sudden stop. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving only the faint emergency lighting that cast the carriage in a dull red glow. The sudden darkness was more than just visually disturbing. It was the kind of darkness that seemed to press in on you, heavy and solid. I could hear the squeak of the brakes and the low rumble of the stalled train settling into silence. People murmured nervously around me. Phones were raised, flashlights blinking on and off, casting long shadows across the walls. I gripped the pole in front of me, trying to keep my balance as the train trembled slightly beneath my feet. The air felt colder, heavier, and I suddenly noticed the smell of something metallic, like iron and dust, mixed with the faint stench of damp concrete. I felt a brush against my arm, soft and deliberate, like someone had leaned past me. I turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. No one had moved. No one was close enough to have brushed me. My heart started racing, the sound loud in my ears. Then the speaker crackled. I froze before even understanding what I was hearing. At first, it was just static, a low hum that made my teeth buzz. Then a voice, distorted and low, whispered my name. It said it slowly, deliberately, drawing it out in a way that made it feel like it was echoing through every corner of the carriage. I tried to tell myself it was just an automated alert or a recording, but the voice kept repeating it over and over, like it was following me, aware of me. I didn't recognize it as human. It was wrong, warped, like the sound had been dragged across gravel, and then back again. I wanted to stand up, to move closer to other people, but my legs felt frozen. The passengers around me were all quiet now, tense, staring at the walls or the ceiling. No one was talking. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow, and the faint creak of the train shifting under its own weight. I told myself to breathe, to calm down, but the more I tried to rationalize it, the stronger the sense of being watched became. It wasn't a person. It was the air, the darkness, the feeling that something inside the train had noticed me. I slowly moved toward the door at the end of the carriage, hoping to see the driver or some kind of emergency sign. The red lights cast long, jagged shadows that made the carriage feel narrower than it was. The air smelled worse as I walked, sweat and metal, old oil, and damp concrete. My footsteps echoed strangely against the walls. Every movement made me hyper-aware of every sound, the shifting of bags, the scrape of a shoe, the faintest cough. But then I realized the voice over the speaker hadn't stopped. My name was still coming through, over and over, like the train itself was calling me, repeating it in a rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. I reached the end of the carriage and looked out the small window into the dark tunnel. There was nothing, just black, and the tracks stretching into the distance. I tapped on the door, hoping it would open, but it was locked. I could see the reflections of passengers in the window, all of them tense, unmoving. The air felt like it was shrinking, like the walls were closing in just slightly, just enough to make every sound, every brush of air, feel amplified. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, my skin prickling, but there was nothing I could touch, nothing I could see to explain it. Minutes passed. It could have been 5, 10, 15. I wasn't keeping track. Time had become irrelevant. The voice finally stopped for a moment, and the silence was worse than the sound. It pressed down on me, a weight in my chest. I wanted to yell, to scream, to ask someone what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. I realized I had been holding my breath, my chest tight and aching. The train shifted again, slightly, a low shudder, and I felt the vibration run through the metal poles and the floor. Then came a small clicking sound. It was rhythmic, like metal scraping against metal, coming from somewhere in the tunnel outside the carriage. People looked toward it, some frozen, some shifting nervously in their seats. The clicking grew louder, faster, and for a moment I thought the train was moving again. The lights flickered back to life, white and harsh, and the shadows disappeared. The voice over the speaker was gone. My name was no longer being whispered. The train jerked forward, moving slowly at first, then picking up speed. The emergency lights turned off completely, leaving only the normal glow of the carriage lighting. Passengers sighed in relief, stretched, and began whispering to each other. I stayed still for a moment, gripping the pole, listening to the hum of the wheels against the track. Everything looked normal again, like nothing had happened. The advertisements on the walls, the reflection of people in the windows, even the man with a newspaper across from me. All of it was ordinary. But my chest still ached from the tension, my hands still trembled slightly. As the train finally reached the next station, the doors opened with a hiss. People filed out quickly, eager to escape the lingering feeling of whatever had been inside the tunnel. I stepped onto the platform, the air warmer and less heavy than it had been underground. I took a deep breath, letting the normal noise of the station, the footsteps, the distant chatter, the sound of trains arriving and leaving, ground me back in reality. I walked up the stairs and out into the street, the city alive and indifferent around me. Lights glared off the wet pavement, buses rumbled past, and the night smelled like exhaust and rain. For a moment, I felt like I could move again, that the tension I'd been holding in my body could finally let go. I realized that what had felt like something sinister wasn't supernatural at all. The train had stopped because of a technical fault. The distorted voice had been a recording glitch in the emergency system, repeating the name of the nearest registered passenger. The brush I had felt might have been someone adjusting their bag or passing too close in the tight space. Everything had a logical explanation, even if it hadn't felt that way in the moment. By the time I reached the station exit, the fear that had gripped me underground was fading. I told myself that sometimes things feel worse in the dark because you don't have all the information. You notice every sound, every movement, every flicker, and your mind fills in the gaps with panic. The city above ground was alive, full of noise, full of people, full of reasons why everything made sense. I walked under the streetlights, past the closed shops and the quiet cafes, and the fear of the tunnels receded further. By the time I got home, the experience felt like a story I would tell later, a reminder of how powerful the mind can be when faced with uncertainty and darkness, and how even the most terrifying moments often have simple, human explanations. The next morning, I read in the news that the Northern Line had experienced a temporary power failure due to a signaling fault. No one was hurt. Everything was back to normal. I understood then that the terror I had felt wasn't about ghosts or anything unreal. It was about being trapped in a space where my senses couldn't trust what they were seeing or hearing. The city's heartbeat had slowed underground, and I had felt every thrum. Walking in the daylight, I felt lighter, calmer. I realized I could handle the darkness now, knowing that logic and patience always bring clarity. The silence had ended, the train had moved, and the night had passed. Everything was fine. By the time I told my story to friends later, I could describe every detail: the smell of the tunnel, the cold brush against my arm, the harsh red light, the distorted voice. They would listen, tense and curious, but it no longer scared me. It was just a memory, a strange, intense moment that reminded me how easily fear grows when your senses are isolated, and how satisfying it feels when reality proves itself calm and ordinary after the storm. The Northern Line carried on, trains gliding through the darkness, passengers coming and going, and I carried the memory with me, alert but unafraid. I had learned that sometimes the scariest moments aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about how alive you feel when the world suddenly becomes unknown, and how good it feels when everything settles back into place. I woke up at exactly 3:27 in the morning to a low buzzing sound coming from the garage below my apartment. At first, I thought it was just some machine left on, or maybe the sound of a car alarm, but the rhythm was strange, uneven, like metal scraping slowly over concrete. My room was dark, heavier than usual, and the sound seemed to echo up from the ground floor. I rubbed my eyes and reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but the moment I flicked the switch, it died with a soft pop. My room stayed in total darkness, and the buzzing seemed louder, closer somehow. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up faintly, but there was no signal. No bars, no messages, nothing. It felt like the entire world outside my apartment had disappeared, leaving me alone with that noise. I considered calling someone in the complex, but even if my phone had worked, who could I call at this hour? I lived alone, and most of the tenants were old or asleep. I pressed my back against the cool wall and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The buzzing continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was making it was moving purposefully across the garage floor. I finally decided to see what was going on. I had lived in this apartment for over a year, and nothing like this had ever happened. I slipped out of bed and quietly padded to the balcony door, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I hesitated before opening the sliding door. The balcony was just a small strip of concrete, barely enough space for a chair, but I had a good view of the garage below. I leaned over the railing, straining my eyes into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows and the faint outlines of cars parked in the garage. Then the silhouettes appeared. They were moving slowly, methodically, but there was something wrong with them. They were tall, unnaturally so, and lanky, their limbs bending at odd angles. They didn't walk like humans. They seemed to glide over the floor, swaying in a jerky, mechanical way. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, maybe someone from the neighborhood who had gotten access to the garage. But no, the shapes were too large, too strange. Their movements didn't make sense, not like any human could move. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the shadows, the dim light playing on the walls and cars. But they were real. I could see the faint outline of thin arms reaching, long fingers brushing along the hoods of the cars. Panic bubbled up inside me. I slammed the balcony door shut, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the lock in place. And then it happened. A cold hand pressed against the glass from the outside. I felt it through the door, icy and solid. My body froze. My first instinct was to scream, but the hand didn't move, didn't pull the door. It just pressed there, steady, unmoving. My stomach dropped, and I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. I didn't know what to do. I backed away from the door, trying to calm myself. My mind raced through every possible explanation, every rational reason this could be happening. Maybe it was a burglary, some crazy person sneaking through the garage. But why would they be so tall? Why would they move like that? And the buzzing, what machine could make that sound while moving like that across the garage floor? Nothing added up. I grabbed my phone again, hoping somehow it had signal now. Still nothing. I pressed the flashlight button, and a weak beam of light barely cut through the darkness. I trained it on the balcony, half expecting to see the hand again. Nothing. The shadows below the balcony shifted, silhouettes moving slowly but purposefully. I realized I wasn't looking at shadows. I was looking at figures that didn't belong. I decided I couldn't stay on the balcony. I moved back inside and locked the door again, sitting on the floor against it. I tried to listen, to understand what they were doing. The buzzing continued, low and steady, almost like a heartbeat. My mind kept going back to the hand, cold and strong against the glass. I kept picturing it over and over, imagining what would happen if it pushed harder. I felt trapped, isolated. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, huddled in the corner of my apartment, listening. Around 5:30, the buzzing stopped. Complete silence fell, heavy and thick. I waited another hour before I dared to move, and even then, I stayed far from the balcony, moving only to check the doors and windows. The garage below looked empty now, normal even. No tall figures, no shadows, no signs of anything unusual. The next day, I called the apartment management. They said there had been no reports of anything strange, no security alerts, no incidents. I checked the garage myself during daylight. Everything looked ordinary: cars, concrete, pipes along the walls. No marks on the floor, no signs of someone entering or exiting. Nothing to explain what I had seen, nothing to explain the hand, nothing to explain the buzzing. I stopped going out on that balcony. Even during the day, it made my skin crawl. I installed extra locks on the sliding door and moved all my furniture so nothing blocked my view of it. At night, I kept a flashlight by the bed and my phone fully charged just in case. I started sleeping with the door to my bedroom locked, even though that didn't make sense. It was a small comfort, but it made me feel slightly safer. Weeks went by. The apartment complex felt normal during the day, quiet in the evenings. I avoided the garage whenever I could, taking the stairs instead of parking near it. I started noticing little things I had ignored before. The way shadows seemed to stretch differently near the garage entrance. The way a car door slamming echoed differently at night. My mind kept going back to that night, to the silhouettes, to the cold hand. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But I knew what I had seen was real. Months later, I finally started to feel safe again. I convinced myself that maybe it had been a trick of the light, maybe I had imagined parts of it. I even went near the balcony during the day, looking down into the garage. It was empty, safe, normal. Then one evening, I heard it again, faint at first, a low, slow buzzing from below. My stomach dropped. I froze. The sound wasn't like any machine I knew, and I didn't recognize it at first. But then it grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone, and for the first time, I had signal. I thought about calling for help, but I couldn't. The buzzing wasn't loud enough for anyone outside to hear. I stayed on the bed, clutching my phone, listening. By the time the buzzing faded, it had left me shaking, but something had changed. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, frozen in fear every night, unable to explain it. I had to take action. I started making a plan. I found a friend willing to let me stay with them temporarily, a place far from the garage, far from the apartment complex. I packed only essentials, leaving everything else behind. I didn't even look back at the balcony when I closed the door. I never returned to that apartment. Months later, I sold everything I couldn't carry and moved across the city. I found a small place, a quiet building with no garages underneath and windows that let in sunlight. The buzzing never followed me. The silhouettes never came near again. I sleep through the night now, door unlocked, light on. I still think about that night sometimes, and my chest tightens when I remember the cold hand pressing against the glass. But I know I made the right choice. I survived because I left. I didn't wait for an explanation, and I didn't try to confront it. Some things are not meant to be understood. Some dangers are not meant to be faced. I walk past garages now without a second thought, and I no longer step onto balconies that overlook dark spaces below. Life is normal, calm, and quiet. I found safety, and I know I will never go back to that apartment above the garage. I never will. The memory is still there, clear and sharp, but it no longer controls me. I left, I escaped, and I rebuilt. And sometimes that is the only ending that matters. I was making my rounds in the hospital late at night, the kind of night when even the fluorescent lights seem tired, flickering as if they're struggling to stay awake. It was 2:46 a.m. at St. Mary's Hospital in Seattle, and the wing I was in was completely empty. Usually, even during the night, there was at least some sound, machines beeping, distant voices, the shuffle of a nurse's shoes. But tonight it felt too quiet, like the building itself had gone to sleep. My janitor cart creaked slightly as I pushed it along the linoleum floor, the wheels echoing down the long hallway. I had a flashlight strapped to my chest, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness at the far end of the hall. The smell of antiseptic mixed with a faint, sour odor of something I couldn't place hung in the air. It was the kind of smell you can't ignore when you're alone, the kind that presses into the back of your nose and makes your stomach tense. I kept walking, wiping down handrails as I went, my movements methodical because the night demanded focus. Hospitals at this hour weren't forgiving of mistakes. Even a small slip could lead to broken equipment, alarms, or worse. I had done this job long enough to know that. Then, as I reached the third door on the left, the lights started flickering. Not the slow, lazy flicker that happens when a bulb is dying. This was rapid, almost panicked, and it made the shadows dance across the floor in jagged, unnatural ways. I stopped for a moment, my hand tightening on the mop handle. The flicker lasted a second too long, and then the lights cut completely. Total darkness swallowed the hallway. I clicked on my flashlight, and the narrow beam of light cut through the black, illuminating just a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard it, the first beep. Then another, and another, but they weren't the normal beeps of a heart monitor. They were off rhythm, irregular, as though something had jammed the circuits. Machines in the rooms I passed began beeping at different intervals, some fast, some slow, some harsh and shrill, making me flinch with each sudden sound. I froze in place, my heart thudding. Then came the dragging sound. A slow, heavy scrape across the floor. I whipped my flashlight around, scanning the dark hallway behind me. At first, I thought maybe a cart had tipped over, or someone had left a stretcher in the hall. But the hall had been empty when I walked past, and no one else was supposed to be there at this hour. The sound got closer, deliberate, steady. My stomach tightened, the way it always does when you sense something is off, something not right. I turned the flashlight fully behind me and saw it. A wheelchair. It was facing the wall, right in the middle of the hall. The kind of wheelchair patients use, metal frame, black leather seat. The thing that made my stomach twist wasn't just that it was there, it was that I'd never seen it before. None of the patients I knew were in wheelchairs tonight, and the rooms along this wing were empty. My mind raced for some logical explanation. A patient had wandered, but there was no one in the chair. No one at all. Just the wheelchair, still and quiet. I blinked, trying to shake the sudden tension, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. Just like that. I stared at the empty space, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, that the lack of sleep and monotony had tricked me. But then I heard it again, the slow, deliberate rolling of wheels on linoleum. My flashlight beam caught it moving toward me, inch by inch. The wheelchair moved steadily, no one behind it, no one pushing. My brain screamed at me that it was impossible, but there it was coming closer. I took a step back, then another, gripping the mop like a lifeline. I told myself it had to be some kind of mechanical malfunction. Maybe a janitor cart had jammed somewhere and picked up speed. Maybe a hospital robot on autopilot had somehow activated in the wrong mode. My mind raced, listing everything logical I could think of, but none of it fit. The chair was just moving, and the sound it made, a hollow scrape over linoleum, was getting louder. The beam of my flashlight shook as I held it out in front of me, casting long shadows along the walls. The walls were painted a pale, hospital green that usually felt soothing, but now they looked grim, almost dirty in the weak light. I could see the reflections of the wheelchair wheels in the polished floor, gleaming in a way that made them seem alive. I could feel every heartbeat in my chest as I watched it inch closer. I tried to step to the side, moving toward a supply closet at the end of the hall, but the hall seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every step I took felt like the chair mirrored me, keeping pace, not fast but inexorably steady. I was trapped in the middle of the hallway with this object moving toward me, with no one controlling it. My breathing got heavier, each inhale loud in the otherwise dead hall. Then I remembered the emergency power switch in the maintenance room. If I could get to it, maybe I could bring the lights back on, maybe whatever was malfunctioning would stop. I pushed myself forward, moving fast, the chair still rolling silently behind me. My cart rattled against the walls as I sped up, heart pounding. When I reached the maintenance room door, I fumbled with the key on my belt, my hands shaking. The chair was now only a few feet behind me. I could hear the wheels click against the floor tiles, each sound like a drumbeat marking my panic. I managed to unlock the door and slammed it behind me, pressing my body against it. The wheelchair stopped at the entrance for a second, just at the edge of the room, then slowly rolled back down the hallway. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I went straight to the emergency power panel, flipped the switches back on, and the lights flickered unsteadily, washing the hall in bright white again. The beeping stopped. The dragging sound vanished. Everything was still. After catching my breath, I walked slowly back into the hall. The wheelchair was gone, completely gone. I checked every room along the wing, every corner, even under beds, but there was nothing. No chair, no patient, no logical explanation. The machines in the rooms were functioning normally. The handrails were just handrails again, and the night air felt ordinary. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. But I did know one thing. I wasn't going to stay in that wing alone again. I spent the rest of the night working in the other wing, the one with the night nurse always nearby. Every time I glanced at the hallway, half expecting the wheelchair to reappear, I forced myself to keep moving. When my shift ended in the early morning, I reported the incident to the night supervisor. They checked the security cameras, but somehow the cameras had nothing. No footage of the chair, no glitch, nothing. They chalked it up to some electrical fault, a temporary system error, but I knew better. I had seen it. After that night, I started checking the wings more carefully, never assuming anything was empty, never walking down a hall without my flashlight fully charged and my radio on. The hospital felt different after that. Empty halls didn't feel safe. Machines didn't just beep, they warned. And I learned something I'll never forget. Sometimes what seems impossible isn't a story or a dream. It's just reality bending in a way you can't explain. Months later, during a routine inspection, I discovered an old, forgotten wheelchair stored in a maintenance closet connected to that wing. It was the exact same kind I had seen, worn in all the right places, with wheels that moved too smoothly almost on their own. Someone had left it near the hall for disposal, and in the darkness, with the flickering lights and the sound of machines, it had seemed alive. It was a simple, physical thing that scared me beyond reason, because for one night, it was unstoppable, and I couldn't understand how. From then on, I never doubted what I saw, and I never underestimated the hospital at night. It wasn't haunted, it wasn't magical, but it had its own way of catching you off guard. The hospital wings were dangerous, not because of ghosts, but because of the ordinary things left unmonitored. Machines, chairs, doors, all of them could become threats in the dark if you weren't careful. And I learned that being careful wasn't enough sometimes. You had to be aware, alert, and ready for the impossible, even when it was something as simple as a wheelchair rolling down an empty hall at 2:46 in the morning. I still push my cart down that wing sometimes, but I do it slowly now, never assuming the halls are empty, never assuming the lights are stable. I know that reality can feel unreal when the timing is just right, and that fear doesn't need ghosts. It needs only a silent hall, a flicker of light, and a chair that moves when you least expect it. And that is enough to make anyone pause and listen, even in a place that should feel safe. By the time the morning shift arrives, the wing seems perfectly normal again. Nurses pass by, patients stir, and everything looks ordinary. But I know the truth. I know the hallway holds its own secrets. And now, whenever I see a wheelchair left alone in a hall, I move it myself every time. I never leave it there. Not because I'm scared of ghosts, but because I know how real fear can get when reality itself seems to turn against you, even for just a few minutes. That night taught me one clear lesson. In a hospital, ordinary things can become terrifying if you ignore them. And sometimes the scariest things are the things that exist, that make perfect sense, but show up in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, when you're completely alone. I've never forgotten that lesson, and I never will. The hallway is still there. I still work those nights. But now I respect it, and I watch it. Because even the most normal things can move in ways you don't expect. And when they do, you have to be ready. It was 12:19 a.m. when I decided to pull over at the tiny gas station on that stretch of rural highway in Iowa. I'd been driving for hours, the long night stretching out ahead of me like a dark, empty tunnel. My eyes were tired, my arms stiff from gripping the wheel, and the hum of the engine had become a dull, constant drone that seemed louder than it should in the quiet night. The station itself looked like it had been there forever, one of those old, forgotten places that seemed stuck in another decade. The neon sign above the pumps flickered intermittently, casting weak, uneven light across the cracked asphalt. Every time it blinked off, the world around me seemed to shrink into shadow, and I felt a little jolt of unease. I pulled the car up to the pump, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The wind was still, which made the silence feel heavier. The building was small, more like a shack than a station, with peeling paint and a metal roof that looked like it would collapse under a heavy snow. I grabbed the gas nozzle and began to fill my tank. The pump clicked in that familiar rhythm, but then, without warning, the lights in the station went out completely. The neon sign above me went dark, and the little bulbs inside the building went dead. I froze for a moment, heart thumping in my chest. Outside, the highway was empty, and the only sound was the low hiss of gas flowing into the tank. The darkness felt dense, almost tangible, pressing against me. My eyes darted toward the glass door of the station, trying to see any movement inside, but everything was pitch black. Then I heard it, a faint whispering, soft and urgent, coming from all around me. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping and impossible to pinpoint. I froze, my hands tightening around the gas nozzle. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe just my imagination, but the whispers had a rhythm to them, almost like they were trying to communicate something. Suddenly, the pumps clicked off on their own. I jumped back, the nozzle still in my hands, my pulse racing. I looked around quickly. The darkness seemed thicker now, and every shadow looked like it could be hiding something just beyond my sight. I took a step back toward my car, but when I glanced at the glass door again, I saw it, dozens of shadowy figures standing behind me, reflected in the glass. They didn't have faces, just dark shapes with a human outline, and they were motionless. I spun around immediately. The gravel crunch of my shoes on the ground sounded unbearably loud in the quiet night. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty pumps and the darkened station. I forced myself to look back at the glass door. The figures were closer this time. My stomach dropped. I could see their shapes more clearly, even though they were still just black silhouettes. My heart was hammering, and I realized I could barely breathe. I took a slow step back, then another, trying to put distance between myself and the glass door. The wind picked up slightly, making the old metal roof groan, and I thought I saw movement in the corner of my vision. I whipped my head around again, nothing. Just the empty lot, the cracked pavement, and the highway stretching into nothing. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. The reflection in the glass was still there, though, now seeming closer than ever, as if the figures had moved right up behind me while I was inside the car. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I considered calling 911, but the cell service here was patchy at best. I realized I had to leave. I had no idea what these figures were, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me staying was not an option. I pressed the gas pedal slowly at first, the tires crunching on the gravel as I edged out of the lot. The figures in the reflection didn't disappear immediately. They seemed frozen in place, watching me as I pulled away. I could still see the flicker of the broken neon sign behind me, and I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. Once I was back on the highway, the dark shapes finally faded from view, leaving only the empty road stretching ahead. For the next few miles, I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. Every time I glanced, I half expected to see something else, but the highway was empty. The silence inside the car was overwhelming. Even the hum of the engine felt loud. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light, a reflection distorted by the cracked glass and the flickering neon. But something in the pit of my stomach refused to let me believe that. I slowed at the next town, a small cluster of buildings with a few dimly lit signs. The streets were quiet, but at least the lights worked here. I pulled into a motel parking lot and sat there for a few minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I kept replaying the reflection, the way the figures had moved closer each time I looked. I couldn't explain it, and that made it worse. Everything about that gas station had felt wrong, but not in a supernatural way, just wrong in a way that made every instinct in my body scream at me to get out. I eventually went inside the motel lobby to check in, trying to act normal. The clerk gave me a bored look and handed me the key without saying much. I told myself I would sleep, try to put the whole thing behind me. But when I got to my room and shut the door, I found that I couldn't stop thinking about the gas station. I kept imagining the figures in the reflection, standing perfectly still watching me. I tried to focus on the mundane, TV, a glass of water, anything, but the images kept creeping back into my mind. Hours passed, and the morning light started to seep through the curtains. I finally forced myself to look at the mirror in the motel room. There was nothing behind me, just the empty room. I felt a little relief, though a part of me remained tense. I realized then that the figures had never physically interacted with me. They hadn't moved toward me or touched me. It wasn't a ghost story or some fairy tale horror. It was something else, something that belonged to the real world. Later that day, I drove past the gas station again, this time in the daylight. From the road, it looked even smaller than I remembered, almost pathetic. The neon sign was broken, flickering uselessly, and the lot was littered with trash and debris. There was no sign of the figures, no whispering, nothing to suggest that what I had seen was real. I pulled off the highway, parked a few hundred feet away, and watched it for a long while. My rational mind told me it had been a trick of reflections, shadows, and exhaustion. But the memory of the darkness and those shapes stayed with me, sharp and precise. I kept driving, taking a long route to avoid stopping in isolated areas. I filled my tank at well-lit stations in towns, always near people, always in view. I didn't want to risk being alone near that gas station, or anywhere like it, ever again. The experience stayed with me, not like a ghost, but as a deep, instinctual warning about isolation, darkness, and the way the mind can play tricks on you when you're tired and vulnerable. In the end, I realized the lesson wasn't about fear of spirits or monsters. It was about paying attention, trusting your instincts, and understanding that sometimes the world can feel threatening without anything supernatural being involved. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the moving reflections, they were a combination of exhaustion, darkness, and the strange ways our brains interpret what we see when we're alone and scared. And yet, the fear felt real. I felt real. And that, I understood, was enough to make me respect the night and the lonely stretches of highway that, in daylight, seemed completely harmless. I never stopped at that gas station again. Every time I drove past it on future trips, I would glance in its direction, but I never pulled in. The station had become a marker in my mind, a reminder that the world is full of moments that can make you feel small and helpless, even when no one is actually there. I understood now that fear doesn't always need a reason beyond what your senses tell you. And I also understood that leaving quickly and decisively was often the only clear choice. That night, the highway taught me that lesson, and I've carried it with me every time I'm alone on a dark road. The memory of that flickering neon, the clicking pumps, and those impossible shadowed shapes is something that still makes my stomach tighten. But I don't think about ghosts or fairy tales when it comes back to me. I think about vigilance, awareness, and the power of paying attention to the world around you. And I think about the night when I learned that fear, real fear, doesn't have to be explained to be understood. It was 4:05 in the morning, when everything went black. I was in the middle of my shower when the lights in my apartment cut out, leaving me standing under the cold spray in complete darkness. At first, I thought it was just a blackout, the kind that happens sometimes in old Brooklyn buildings, but there was something about the silence that didn't feel normal. Usually, I'd hear the faint hum of the fridge, the low rumble of the radiator, or even the occasional muffled voices from other apartments. But tonight, the building was quiet, eerily quiet, except for a sound I couldn't ignore, the muffled banging coming from the apartment next door. I froze in the shower, trying to make sense of it. The banging was slow at first, almost deliberate, like someone was moving furniture or hitting the walls with something heavy. It wasn't rhythmic or musical, it was random, jagged, and loud enough to make the pipes rattle. My first thought was that maybe someone had dropped something, but the noise kept repeating, like it was happening over and over with no real purpose. My pulse started to pick up. I wrapped myself in a towel and grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen counter. The hallway was darker than I expected. The emergency exit light in the stairwell cast a dim, orange glow that barely reached the end of the corridor. I held the flashlight tight in one hand, shining it at the door next to mine. It was slightly ajar. That made my stomach twist. I lived in this building for over 3 years, and I knew that door was always locked. Usually you could see the peephole glinting in the light, but tonight it was open like someone had just stepped out. Or maybe someone hadn't stepped out at all. I hesitated for a long moment before I pushed it open. The door creaked softly, the sound loud in the silence of the hall. My flashlight cut through the darkness, painting long, sharp shadows on the walls. The apartment next door was empty, or at least it looked empty. The living room was bare except for a single rocking chair in the corner, moving slowly back and forth. The sound it made was subtle but distinct, a slow creak, creak, creak that echoed against the walls. I didn't see anyone in it, but the motion was steady and precise, like someone invisible was sitting there, using just enough weight to keep it moving. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was just a draft or some old building quirk, but the feeling in my chest said otherwise. I stepped further inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Every step felt loud, like the apartment itself was listening to me. The rocking chair slowed as I approached, and when I blinked, it stopped completely. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing against my skin. I turned my flashlight slowly, scanning the corners of the room, and that's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not just noticed, but fully observed from somewhere just out of my sight. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything moving, but I knew I wasn't alone. I froze in place, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The longer I stared, the more I could sense the presence. It wasn't physical, not like a person standing there, but it was aware of me. It shifted whenever I moved, retreating to a different shadowed corner every time my eyes tried to catch it. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a neighbor, sneaking around while drunk or angry. Maybe someone had broken in and was hiding. But none of it felt right. The apartment smelled clean, almost sterile, with faint traces of bleach and old carpet, like no one had lived there for a while. I decided to check the rest of the apartment. The kitchen was small, old cabinets lined the walls, and the sink was empty and spotless. Nothing was out of place, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing that suggested anyone had been moving around violently. The bedroom was the same, neat, almost antiseptic, with a bed perfectly made and no sign of life. I kept my flashlight moving slowly, scanning for anything, every shadow and dark corner. And still, that feeling followed me, tight in my chest, gnawing at the edges of my reason. Then I noticed it, a faint scuff mark on the wall near the window. It wasn't new, but it hadn't been there the last time I had glanced through this apartment from my own. It looked like someone had dragged their shoe along it, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me uneasy. My eyes flicked to the window, half expecting to see someone outside, but the street below was dark and empty, quiet as a tomb. My heartbeat was hammering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was too curious, or too scared, to move. I took another step toward the rocking chair, my flashlight trembling slightly. When I got closer, I realized the chair wasn't just rocking randomly. The floor beneath it had tiny scratches, like the wood was worn down in one precise path. Someone had been sitting there for hours, maybe even days, always in the same spot. I leaned down to inspect it closer, my stomach twisting. The more I looked, the more the apartment felt, lived in a way that didn't make sense. There were faint fingerprints on the windowsill, dust brushed away in some areas, and tiny indentations in the carpet, like someone had been kneeling there. Whoever it was hadn't left in a hurry, they had been careful. Deliberate. I straightened up, and that's when I heard it again, the faint, muffled banging from the apartment behind mine. Not as loud, not as random as before. This time it was precise, like someone was testing the walls, listening for me. My throat tightened. I knew I had to leave. I backed toward the door slowly, never taking my eyes off the rocking chair. When I reached the threshold, I turned back for one last look. The chair was still. The air felt empty again. I shook my head, telling myself I had imagined it all. Maybe someone had left the apartment minutes ago, and the noises were just residual. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me slowly, listening. The building was silent once more, nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator from my own apartment. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my living room, flashlight in hand, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. By sunrise, I had convinced myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination, overactive from the darkness and the isolation of the early morning hours. Days later, I mentioned the incident to a neighbor, someone who had lived here longer than I had. She gave me a long, hard look before telling me something that chilled me completely. Apparently, the apartment next door had been empty for months. The last tenant had left suddenly, and the landlord hadn't found anyone to take it. No maintenance workers had been inside recently either. She shrugged, then added that sometimes at night, people hear strange noises from empty units, old pipes, settling floors, things like that. But I knew what I had felt. Weeks passed. I checked the apartment multiple times, sometimes even with my friend accompanying me, but it was always empty, neat, and quiet. The rocking chair never moved again. But I never forgot the weight in the corner of that room, the sense that someone, or something, was watching me, always just out of sight. I stopped staying up late. I never showered at night anymore. I even started sleeping with my door locked, flashlight by my bed just in case. I never saw who, or what, was in that apartment. I never heard the banging again. But the memory stayed with me crystal clear. A rocking chair moving on its own, a presence in the corner, and the horrifying certainty that someone had been there, hidden, waiting. I learned to live with it, to accept that some things in old buildings aren't explained by logic. Even now, years later, I avoid going near that apartment at night. I hear my neighbors moving around sometimes, the usual creaks and bangs, but I never let myself get curious again. And I think about that night, standing there in the dark, feeling someone watch me, and I know that some parts of the world are just better left alone. It ended not with a scream or confrontation, but with understanding that I wasn't safe, that the world holds spaces that feel occupied even when they aren't, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you see, but what you know is there, even if it leaves no trace. I stopped trying to understand it fully. I stopped opening doors I didn't need to. and slowly, carefully, I went back to living, always aware, always cautious, and forever changed. The apartment next door remains empty to this day, and I make sure it stays that way in my mind. The memory is enough. It's enough to make me respect the silence, to respect the shadows, and to respect the unseen presence that made me feel more exposed and vulnerable than I ever had before. I never went back inside. I never will. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and it was terrifying, and it changed the way I live my life. I was sitting at my desk in my dorm room at the University of Michigan, fingers frozen over the keyboard, staring at the blank screen. My essay was due in a few hours, and I was finally finding my rhythm when the lights flickered and then went out completely. The hum of the air conditioning died, and my laptop went black midward. The sudden silence pressed down on me. It was 11:59 p.m., right before midnight. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but the screen was dim, barely holding a charge. I realized the entire dorm must be affected. The building felt different instantly, heavier, quieter, but somehow tense, like it was holding its breath. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long, and cautiously moved to the door. The hall outside was pitch black except for a faint light coming from my phone. I could make out the shapes of doors along the hallway, all slightly ajar, swaying gently back and forth. At first, I thought maybe someone had been careless and left them open, but the movement was too slow, too even, to be caused by a breeze. The doors seemed to pulse slightly, like they were breathing. My stomach turned. I called out for my roommate, my voice louder than I intended. "Hey, you there?" No answer. Silence. Not even a shuffle of movement in the hallway. I waited for a few seconds, hoping she was just asleep or didn't hear me, but the emptiness pressed in, making me nervous. The footsteps started then, slow and deliberate. Heavy, flat steps that seemed to echo through the dorm, but not in a way that matched the structure of the hall. They weren't coming from a single direction. I froze, holding my phone like a lifeline, scanning the dark corridor. Nothing. I forced myself to step out, the floor cold under my socks. Each step I took felt loud in the quiet. The hallway was longer than it should have been, shadows pooling around the corners. I passed my neighbor's door. It was swinging slowly, and the motion caught the corner of my eye. The shadows inside looked deeper than darkness should be, almost like the walls themselves were moving. My pulse was pounding. I glanced down the hall toward the stairwell, then back toward my room. The footsteps hadn't moved. They seemed to be circling, moving closer and farther at the same time. Then I heard it. Whispering. Soft at first, almost like the wind brushing against the window. Then louder, clearer, insistent. I could make out words, my name, repeated over and over. It was coming from my room. My hands trembled as I held the phone up, trying to see through the darkness. I wanted to run, but something rooted me in place. The whispering was relentless, echoing off the walls, bouncing from the ceiling. It didn't make sense, and yet it was unmistakable. I had to see what was happening. I stepped back into my room slowly, every muscle tense. The whispering grew louder as I crossed the threshold. The door swung shut behind me with a quiet thud, and I jumped. My flashlight flicked across the room, revealing my desk, my bed, and the small clutter of personal items that always made the space feel mine. Everything looked normal, except the whispering kept coming from everywhere at once. My laptop sat on the desk, still black. Papers were scattered around it, as if someone had rifled through them, but I had been alone. I backed up to the bed, trying to think. The voices were too close now, almost like they were under my skin. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I realized my phone's battery was dropping fast, leaving me with almost no light. I had to do something. I forced myself to take a deep breath and focus. There had to be a rational explanation. I remembered the emergency lights in the hallways. Maybe if I could make it to the stairwell, I could get to the lobby and find someone. My feet moved slowly at first, testing the floor. The whispering stayed behind me as I edged toward the door. I twisted the handle, expecting resistance, but it turned easily. I stepped out into the hallway. The doors were still moving, the shadows still pooling, but the whispering was fading as I moved away. My relief was short-lived because the footsteps began again, following me. I hurried down the hall, trying to keep my phone steady. The stairwell at the end of the hall seemed impossibly far. Every time I passed a door, it creaked, swinging wider as if in warning. The whispers softened, then stopped, leaving only the thudding echo of my own steps and the distant creaks of the building settling. I reached the stairwell and pushed open the heavy door. Darkness greeted me, but at least there were walls, at least there was a way down. I carefully descended, counting each step to keep myself calm. By the time I reached the first floor, I could see faint lights flickering in the lobby. Someone had managed to turn on a generator or emergency lights. I hurried over, my relief growing with every step. There were a few other students huddled in corners, their faces pale, whispering to each other about the blackout. The whispering in my head had completely vanished, replaced by the normal, human sounds of murmurs and movement. An older staff member noticed me and guided me to a working phone. I called my parents, told them I was okay, then asked about my roommate. They told me she had been stuck in her own room with the door jammed by the sudden power surge. She was fine, just shaken, and someone helped her get out. Eventually, maintenance restored the power. Lights flickered back on throughout the building, and the dorm slowly returned to normal. My room, my desk, and my laptop were all exactly as I had left them, no signs of anyone else having been there. Everything made sense again. The doors had swung from air pressure changes. The whispering had been my own panic echoing in the pitch dark, making every creak and shadow feel like a presence. Sitting back at my desk, I realized how easily fear can twist reality. My essay was still due. The blackout hadn't helped, but I had survived. I wrote the rest of the night by emergency light, heart still racing, but steady enough to focus. By morning, the building was fully restored, the dorm buzzing with stories of the blackout, of strange sounds, of doors that seemed to move on their own. I didn't see anything supernatural. There were no ghosts, no figures lurking in the corners. There was only the building, old and creaky, the sudden absence of light, and my mind turning every tiny sound into something terrifying. In the end, I learned that fear doesn't need monsters. It just needs darkness, silence, and a room full of unknowns to make a simple blackout feel like something much worse. The dorm returned to its normal rhythm, the lights stayed on, and I finished my essay with a quiet smile, knowing that whatever had frightened me was entirely real and entirely explainable. Even now, whenever the lights flicker or the power goes out, I remember that night. I remember the fear, the whispers, and the swinging doors. I remember the emptiness of the hall and the way every sound seemed louder than it should. But I also remember the relief, the steps I took to make it through, and the fact that nothing had actually touched me. Nothing had to. Sometimes the scariest things are just your own mind in the dark, and knowing that makes the world seem quieter, safer, and a little more manageable. By the time I fell asleep the next morning, exhausted but safe, I realized I had grown a little braver. Darkness didn't have to be dangerous, it just had to be faced. And that night, I faced it, one careful step at a time. The sound of the storm tearing through the small town. It was 2:02 in the morning, the kind of hour when the world feels paused and heavy. The wind rattled the windows so hard I thought they might shatter, and then everything went completely dark. The power had gone out. My heart jumped, and for a moment I just lay in bed, listening to the storm hammering against the house. The house was silent except for the wind, or so I thought. I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed a candle. Lighting it, I watched the small flame tremble as the air moved around it. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, throwing the furniture into strange, shifting shapes. The familiar lines of my bedroom suddenly felt wrong. The dresser looked taller. The mirror on the wall seemed to lean closer than it should. I tried to shake it off as imagination, but then I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the roof. It was irregular, like someone walking carefully but dragging something along with them. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just debris blown by the wind, but the sound didn't stop. It moved. It paused. It shifted again. My pulse raced, and I realized I had to check. I climbed out of bed, candle in hand, feeling the cold of the wooden floor seep through my socks. Each step to the stairs felt loud, echoing in the heavy silence. I reached the top of the staircase, and then stopped. Nothing. The scraping had stopped. The roof, the attic space above the house, nothing. I shone the candle into the shadows, scanning the ceiling, the rafters, even the small storage closet in the corner. Empty. I breathed out slowly, feeling my body tense and untensing all at once. I turned to go back downstairs, and then noticed something that made my stomach drop. The candle flickered violently, and then went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My eyes strained, trying to see anything at all. The storm outside pounded harder against the house, and through the loud thrum of rain and wind I heard it, Footsteps. They were soft at first, almost cautious, pacing back and forth directly above me. My house only had one story. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I held the candle out in front of me, hoping the dim glow might reveal something, but it was gone. The footsteps continued. They moved slowly, deliberately, then paused as if listening. I could feel the vibration in the floor, subtle but real. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call 911, but there was no signal. The storm had cut everything off. My mind raced. I considered all the possibilities, an animal trapped in the attic, someone breaking in, but none of it made sense. There wasn't an attic, not in the part of the house I could access. Only the crawl space beneath the roof, which was sealed off and used for storage. I hadn't heard it open. I remembered the old window in the living room, the one that hadn't been sealed properly. Maybe the wind had forced something through it. Maybe. I didn't want to think about someone actually being inside my house. The thought made my skin crawl, but I knew I had to face it. Slowly, carefully, I crept toward the living room. Every step made me aware of the echo of my own movement. The footsteps above me had stopped, and the silence was worse than the storm. I reached the living room and felt along the walls for the window. My fingers found the latch, cold metal in the wet air seeping through the cracks. The window was closed. No sign of entry. Nothing. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door, which I was certain I had locked before bed, was slightly ajar. I froze. I hadn't touched it. I never left it unlocked at night. The wind was still howling outside, but the door didn't move. Someone had to have opened it. I gripped the edge of the door and pulled it closed. My hands were shaking, but it stayed shut. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, and then I realized the footsteps had started again. They were slower this time, circling the floor, moving closer to me. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the drawer, its metal cold in my hands. The storm outside made the room feel even darker, shadows dancing across the walls as I flicked the switch on. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing at first. I swept it across the room, the hallway, the corners, nothing. But then I saw it. A smear of mud on the floor, near the back door. Fresh. Someone had been inside. I felt a mixture of fear and resolve. I had to do something. I couldn't just wait for this person to make a move. My mind raced through every scenario. I checked the windows again, the locks, the doors. Everything was as secure as I could make it quickly. I needed to stay in one place, somewhere I could defend myself if needed. I went back to the living room and pulled the heavy coffee table in front of the door. Then I did something I didn't think I would. I decided to confront the situation logically. There had to be an explanation. The crawl space under the roof came to mind again. It had a small door, often left slightly ajar when I carried boxes in and out. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Maybe some animal, raccoon, squirrel, something, had gotten inside. The footsteps, the scraping, it all could be explained that way. I forced myself to believe it. Slowly, I made my way to the crawl space. The flashlight illuminated the narrow hallway, the flickering shadows making it seem worse than it was. I opened the small door, heart in my throat, and shone the light inside. It was a raccoon. Large, muddy, panicked. Its eyes glinted in the flashlight, wild and terrified. It had climbed through the small opening near the roof, getting into the crawl space, and then running along the ceiling beams above the one-story house. The scraping, the pacing, it was all caused by this animal, trying to find a way out. Relief washed over me in a rush so strong I felt dizzy. My chest loosened, and I laughed quietly at myself for being terrified. I carefully coaxed the raccoon toward the open window and watched as it disappeared into the storm. The wind still rattled the house, the rain still hammered the windows, but the tension was gone. I went back to the living room, relocked every door, and sat on the couch with the flashlight still in hand. The storm had knocked out the power, but I felt a strange sense of calm, knowing the noise and chaos had a simple explanation. I could finally breathe. The storm lasted for hours, but I stayed awake, listening, alert. Every now and then, I would hear a branch tapping against the roof or the wind whistling through the trees, but it was nothing that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The house felt solid, secure mine. By the time the storm passed and the power returned, the sun was beginning to rise. Warm light crept through the windows, washing the shadows away. I had survived the night, shaken but safe. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the chaos of the storm replaced by the calm of morning. The mud from the raccoon had dried near the back door, a reminder of the night, but it no longer carried terror. I cleaned it up slowly, methodically, enjoying the routine. By the time I was done, the house felt like home again. Safe, ordinary, predictable. The experience stayed with me, but not in a frightening way. It reminded me of how quickly fear can take over, how easily our minds fill in gaps with worst-case scenarios. And it reminded me to check the little things, the crawl space door, the window latches, the back door, so that I could sleep without dread. That night had been terrifying, yes, but it ended with a clear, simple truth. The storm was fierce, the wind was wild, and sometimes strange sounds happen. But sometimes there is a real, explainable reason for them. And once you find it, you can finally let yourself relax. I looked around the house, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, and for the first time since the storm began, I smiled. I was safe. The night had passed. The house on the hill, once filled with shadows and strange noises, felt like home again.